Okay, in this next part, we're going to talk about audience a lot more. And I want to start with this idea. People don't engage with science, people engage with people. Does anyone have any reaction to that?
I agree.
You agree? Yes? Right. I also agree. Yes.
I also agree, and I believe that when you start talking, they don't see you as a scientist until you introduce yourself. They just see you as a person.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I agree, but for me, I want to put it to a broader perspective. Even communication, some people will just look at you and switch off, even before you start communicating. So some people do not relate with the message, but relate with the person, and they choose whether to listen or not to.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes. Just, I think it depends on the sense. Which sense? If science belongs to, for example, science or health or the social issue, they are interested.
That's a very good point, and something that we'll talk a little bit more about later.
Geoscience?
Yeah, it can be a lot more difficult with geoscience because people, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, usually react to science communication in terms of risk perception. How does this affect me? All right. Or what is the opportunity for me? So with things like health, then that can perhaps be a bit clearer. Yeah.
Okay, with respect to what my sister just said from Uganda, I think it is usually influenced by our perceptions as scientists. The way you dress, the way you talk. In my culture, when you want to interact with a person, you have to dress the way they dress. When you go for community reach out, you have to know how that community dresses. You come dressed in their attires. So they start listening to you before they try to interpret who you are. Because if you come as you are, they'll just dismiss whatever you are coming with.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. I used to work in Australia, in Northern Australia, and did a lot of community meetings with Aboriginal Australian people. And a new guy who was working in my group, he came to one of the community engagement meetings with me. And just before we went in, we were due to go into the room, a few minutes beforehand, he showed up and he was wearing a suit and a tie. And I said, for God's sake, take off your tie.
In my culture, ladies are not allowed to wear pants. Yet at work, you have to wear your most comfortable, you have more pants and go. But when you go for community reach outs, you cannot come dressed as a geologist.
Yeah. 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 Good. All right. So we're going to talk a lot about people. Right. And we've already... Okay. So before I go on to this, to talk about people engaging with people. Now, there was a paper published last year, and I'll refer you to a webinar about it, which is very good, on the impact of participatory research for environmental justice, so involvement of communities in environmental justice work. And researchers looked at 154 case studies involving participatory research, so research involving the community on environmental health. Of those, 26 of 154 achieved their goals of structural change, so outcomes that meant changes in behaviours or operation procedures and so on. Of those 26, 100%, all of them, started with local knowledge informing the research question. If you engage with your target audience at the start and actually involve them and get their opinions, you're far more likely to succeed in achieving your goals of communicating. Right, so there's been a lot said and written about scientists being not very good at communication, and it's variably true. Here's a geoscience example. So we all know that we need qualified geoscientists for a whole range of different fields related to tackling climate change and moving towards sustainable futures. We need more raw materials, we need for renewable technologies and all the infrastructure that's involved and so on. But at the same time, this is what has happened to student numbers at universities all around the world in geoscience. Dramatic drops over the past 10 years. And there are a range of reasons, but there is a real failure in communication between the geoscience community and governments and publics about the value and relevance of geoscience to societal goals. Now, there are obviously some very good communicators out there, but as a community of scientists, we're not very successful, apparently. So why aren't we very good at this? Any idea? As scientists, why aren't we able to effectively communicate? Does anyone have any thoughts? Yes?
We're not taught how to.
We're not taught how to. Yes, good point. Yeah.
We were not born scientists. Sorry? We were not born scientists. We were not born as scientists.
Born as scientists.
Yes.
Yeah? What do you mean by that?
It's second nature to us. Yes, it becomes us, but it's second nature. It's easy to communicate something that you were born in than something that you have learned.
Uh-huh. Good. All right. Good. All right. One suggestion that's been made by some authors about why we're not very good at scientists as communicating is because as scientists we're trained to communicate with other scientists, usually within our own discipline. And what that means is that we often use jargon because we expect people to understand it. But more fundamentally, the style of communication is different. So as scientists, what we normally do is this. We've done some work to investigate a problem, and if we're lucky, we've got a good result and that we can report. So we're really excited about this conclusion. That's what we're focused on. So it's the message. It's the what. That's what we want to get across. And that's what we focus on in scientific papers. And we know or usually assume that other scientists in our field understand the significance in the broader context, but we will usually put it into some context. So we say why we did it, why this is important, all right? We'll have a little bit about that. And then usually we don't actually think at all about the who, because we know we're just communicating with other scientists. They know, they're going to understand what it's all about. We don't really need to think about them. All right. And we're trained to communicate like this, and so that's often how we communicate with everyone. But what's wrong with this? It's the wrong way round. It's completely the wrong way round. All right, if we think back to the last model that I showed you, the transactional model of communication, which is generally considered to be the most effective. The focus is on who, because we're social creatures, all right? The sort of point that you were making, that we start from birth communicating in a different kind of a way, and then we learn to be scientists. We're social creatures. We're wired to communicate with each other. And social communication is what has made us the dominant species on the planet. And when you find that you're being really successful in communicating your science, it's usually because you're connected to the person that you're communicating with. And if you think about science communicators that you think are fantastic, for example, David Attenborough, I might have different science communication heroes than you do. Brian Cox, Ian Stewart is a great geoscience communicator. Even for people who are old enough to remember, Carl Sagan was an amazing science communicator. You probably have other people you know of. Really engaging people. And it almost becomes more about the person than the science. Even before they start talking, you think, oh, what are they going to say? This is going to be great. Yeah? In a 2012 study published in the International Journal of Science Education, experts in science communication were asked what they considered the essential elements of a science communication course for postgraduate students. And I'll read from you the abstract, from part of the abstract. There was a high level of agreement amongst these experts that the audience comes first, and their statements signal the importance of developing empathetic skills to engage audience. Science communication courses should focus on the audience and how to access their needs, priorities, and imagination. They signalled a need for more dedicated science communication courses where students need to develop a broad understanding of the science and social issues rather than narrowly focusing on technical media skills development. So that's what the experts in science communication say. So only after a really serious look at who, our audience, how do we reach them, would you then tackle why. And specifically, the why is related to your audience. Why is it relevant to them? And then, what exactly should your message be? What? Framed in the right way for your audience. So again, the what is about who. It's all about who. People engage with people. Okay. So now we're going to look more at who's involved in communication. What are their backgrounds? What's the starting point of their knowledge? And now let's think more. What might influence your audience in terms of how they engage with science? So I'm going to start with one. One is one that I can relate to is culture. So I worked in Northern Australia as a mapping geologist for about 8 years. And I spent a lot of time working on Aboriginal land, talking to Aboriginal traditional owners, because we weren't allowed to work on their land without prior agreement on issues related to cultural heritage. So some areas we weren't allowed to work. And these community consultations and one-to-one engagement with Aboriginal Australians, I regard as some of the most meaningful and fascinating parts of my work there. Some of those consultations I wasn't allowed to attend because women weren't allowed to be involved. Others, only women were allowed to be involved. And if you're interested in the intersection between Aboriginal culture and geology, there's a fantastic film which was in the Earth Futures Film Festival about this, about Aboriginal Australian land and interaction with geologists. So in my case, when I was working with traditional owners, it became clear to me really quickly that I wasn't going to be able to simply turn up and have what I considered to be a normal conversation about what I wanted to do and get a yes-no answer. What was needed was a large investment of time and effort showing up and again and being consistent and open and honest until the community had decided that I was trustworthy, and trust was an issue that was raised before. That was the fundamental thing that was required. Everything else, understanding of what I was going to do, all the rest, totally ancillary to that. So what else might influence your audience in terms of the factors on how they engage with science? Any other ideas? Culture. What else? Language, yes. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Politics, yes. Knowledge, yeah. Yep.
Benefits.
Yeah, their assessment of what the benefits are going to be or what the risks are going to be. I'll put up a few more things. Any prior experience they've had of a similar nature. Their fundamental values and beliefs. How old are they? Their sense of identity. If you challenge their identity in your science, you're going to have a really hard time communicating. What are their priorities? If they're thinking about how to get some food for their kids for dinner tonight, they're probably not going to be interested in what you're doing next month in terms of soil survey. Emotion. Science capital. So this is the sum total of all of their experience with science previously. Some people have lots of good science education at school. They have parents who are interested in science who might seek out information and promote the idea that science is really interesting and important. Other people don't have that at all. So all of that background in how they have previously engaged in science will influence how they feel about it now. Okay. This, it's a bit hard to see, but this is from a report to the European Commission on planning for risk communication. And this is in relation to health. And there's a lot of literature about communication in terms of risk, because this is how most people approach engagement with science, from the frame of risk. Opportunity, but more commonly risk. How's it going to affect me? How's it going to affect my community or my environment or my children? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to get a job? Are my children going to get sick? Can I make some money out of this? All of these kinds of questions. And this is a representation of how they categorize the influences on how people think about risk, and it's a lot of the same kind of things. You can see politics is here, culture, societal and economic factors, trust, knowledge is there, but it's just one part of the whole picture. Biases, intuition, emotions, beliefs. How does this relate to my whole worldview? And similarly here, they've divided this into different types of influences. Cognitive factors, knowledge and understanding, personal experience, social and cultural factors, and then individual preferences or influences. And, okay. So, and just in case you want to read this, and I'll give you the reference to this later, a spoiler alert, they concluded that to effectively engage and communicate risk to improve decision-making, the audience must feel engaged and feel represented. They must feel like they've been heard. All right. I'm going to go back to the exercise you did in dialogue. One of the things that I was hoping that you might get from this was a feeling that, okay, I have to hold myself back from engaging here and leave this open to the other person. And perhaps you might have heard some things from the other person that wouldn't have been the questions you asked directly. This idea of being very much open to your audience and seeing what's important to them is really important in communication if you want it to be successful. And so that's the idea of trying to, at least at the start, put all the emphasis on your audience, see what their perspectives are without imposing anything from your side. Okay. Identity, beliefs, values. Just to reiterate this point, that beliefs, identity and values, these are fundamental to all of us. If the communication that you're having challenges these aspects of a person, it's very difficult to communicate, all right? It can be really threatening. So one important thing, if there are real differences here, is to try and emphasize shared values. Find the places where you do connect, all right? You may never connect on some issues, but if you need to connect with, in a situation where people have very different values and understandings, identities, then this is what you should try and do. All right, so your audience's perceptions are shaped by all these things: culture, beliefs, values, attitudes, etc. So are yours, all right? Consider yourself in the communication as well. You are not completely outside of this, you're a part of it. Your values, beliefs, and so on are also going to drive how the communication happens. And if you consider them carefully, they can help you. So, I would recommend that you read about this, the ambassador model. The idea of this, objectives of this model are to first do an analysis of who you are. What are your values? What do you believe in? What do you enjoy? How do you like to communicate? All of this kind of stuff. And then connect with your audience in a way that is compatible with yourself. So instead of, I don't know, embarking on writing a blog, all right? Maybe you're not very comfortable with writing. It's just been decided that this is an appropriate way. Maybe you're not the right person for that. So consider that. Do you like to do art? Do you like to engage with children? Think about what you're good at and what you enjoy, and try and shape your communication also around those possibilities, because you might be much more effective if you use what you already have. So the objectives of this model are to demonstrate scientists and audience have shared values. So first of all, you consider yourself, you connect with your audience, identify these shared values, and reveal that the scientists are not just scientists. They also have an identity and, you know, an environment that they work in as a person. So my example, that maybe you're good at interacting with kids and doing art, okay? If people can see this side of you and not just the science side of you, then it's easier for them to connect with you as a person. Also, this model aims to show that the scientific community actually cares about the community's well-being and opinions, and wants to learn from their audience. We're going to talk more about this. So early in the communication, ideally you're trying to get the audience to communicate with you. Again, you can have a look at this later, but a lot of models have this kind of process in common. First of all is making this connection with your audience. So if you want to do a communication project, before you even start, you need to make sure you have this connection. Do you have a way in to your audience? If you don't, is there someone who can help you with that, who already has a connection, who can introduce you and start having a communication? And then engage. Get the information back from your audience, see where they're at, what do they care about. And only down here you start to think about, okay, what do I need to tell them? Okay, I had this idea about what I wanted to say, but maybe it's something different now. And then move around to figure out what kind of activity is appropriate, reflect on how that worked, and so on in a circular manner. So I know I went through that very quickly, but we'll come back to a lot of these things. All right, I won't go into this again. What I want to do now is talk about emotion. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because it's extremely important for communication. I think as scientists, sometimes we don't really consider emotion much, because emotion is not generally a part of the science we do. In scientific communication, in publications, it's just not considered. Maybe it's not thought to be really that appropriate, but it's extremely important to consider emotion. And I'm going to start with a very sad story that demonstrates an example of this. So, 20 years ago, two planes collided mid-air near an airport on the Swiss-German border, and everyone involved was killed in this accident. And the investigation that followed revealed that there were a number of failures that contributed to why this happened, but the one that's relevant to this involves emotion. So 45 seconds before the collision, both of the pilots received messages from their automated anti-collision systems that instructed them respectively, in one case to descend, in the other case to ascend. And that would have avoided the collision. But 1 second after they received that automated information, the air traffic controller on the ground instructed the pilot who was told to gain altitude to descend to avoid the collision. So this pilot was receiving conflicting information. On the one hand, the automated system was telling him in a very calm human voice, ascend, ascend. On the other hand, the guy on the ground was saying with increasing urgency, descend, you must descend now. And the pilot hesitated, and then he responded to the guy on the ground, the human. And one of the conclusions was that this more emotional instruction from the controller on the ground contributed to the pilot making that decision. So the reason I give this example is to make the point that we are emotional creatures. We respond to emotion, we feel emotion. It's actually one of the key tools that we have as humans to make decisions about information we're receiving, to decide whether it's important and how to respond to it. There are very strong links between emotion, cognition, so knowledge, attitudes and behaviour. So if we think that emotion doesn't play a role in science, we're wrong. For example, few people would argue that attention is necessary for communication. You need to pay attention to something to receive that communication, to learn something, right? Well, neuroscience has proven that one of the main criteria that our brains use to sift through information and decide whether to pay attention to it is emotion, the emotional value that it holds. And here's the example. Okay? Now, I don't know, some of you might feel a reaction to that. A lot of people are scared of spiders. They're scared of snakes. They react to angry faces. This is a survival mechanism. It's an emotion, all right? So we immediately pay attention to things like that. But it doesn't have to be a threat, and I'm not telling you to threaten people when you communicate with them. For example, if you're feeling hungry, you might start looking for somewhere to eat. Your attention is focused on that. This is also an emotional response. Emotion guides our attention. So using emotional stimuli can help you to capture attention. But even more than that, all cognitive activity is motivated by basic emotional and motivational drives. Our emotions are fundamental to how we think and learn. And if you're still feeling like perhaps you don't know how to connect emotions with science without just being a bit over-emotional, then, you know, consider you might have been disappointed by some project scientific project you're involved in, that it didn't go the way you were expected, or really happy about a result that you got, or a discovery you made, or really excited about what the potential was for where this science was going. And as geologists, field geologists will probably feel something when they visit a really good outcrop, for example, or climb a mountain. These are all emotions. And they're very common in science, so we can use them. Right, I also wanted to say that not only attention but memory is extremely important in terms of emotion. So we prioritize and remember things when we have this emotional connection. So there's a lot of information around that from scientific studies that show that emotional events are usually remembered much more clearly, more consistently between people, and for longer periods of time than events that have no emotion associated with them. Okay. But if you're feeling, you know, how am I going to introduce emotion to my communication? Well, here are some words that we might associate with scientific work that we do: novelty, incongruity, uncertainty, curiosity, humour, etc. I've just underlined things that have an obvious emotional content, but in fact all of them do. For example, challenge usually has an element of excitement or intimidation, or comprehension is often fulfilling. You know, you feel good when you understand something, and so on. So you probably wouldn't have a problem with incorporating some of these ideas into the communication that you're making. If you can incorporate some emotional feeling, then you're much more likely to make that engagement. Right, this is another key point. Often when we're communicating science, we don't just want to influence people's knowledge and skills, but often we want to change their attitudes and behaviours. If we want to do that, then the most effective way you can do that is with emotion. Emotion is a key driver of action. For example, we all have all sorts of pressures on us, deadlines and problems of all different sizes and kinds in our lives every day that we have to deal with. But generally, you're not going to get out of your chair and start doing something about a problem until you've reached a certain level of stress, fear, anxiety, or even excitement about that issue. That's when you start doing something, when you feel enough emotion about it. All right. Let's talk a little bit about types of audience. Now, every single person is different. So if you want to engage with, but it is still useful to try and categorize audiences a bit, at least so you can start thinking about how am I going to structure things for a certain audience. And there are lots of different ways that audiences have been categorized, which can be useful. So this is just a starting point. This is from the British Science Association. You can find it on their website. And they've categorised British audiences in this way in regard to science. So first of all, you've got these people who are not interested. They see that science is not for them. It's not the least bit interesting. They probably have a low science capital. They don't have much scientific education background. They haven't engaged, they don't go to museums very much. Their parents have never expressed any interest in science, really. Then you have inactive people. So they have an interest in science, but they're not actually going to actively go out and look for it. If it comes their way, then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, all right, that's interesting. Then you've got the engaged people up here. So these are still non-technical people. They're really enthusiastic and they actually look for information about science and, you know, scientific events and so on. And then the professionals down here, like you, these are people who are engaged in actively in science. They produce or they curate scientific knowledge. The point of categorizing audiences like this is that it's a tool that you can use. So thinking about this helps you to design how you're going to communicate for these audiences. And to give you a bit of more of a feel for these groups, and this only applies to the UK, as I said, it'll be completely different in different places, but there might be some similarities. So in the professional category, this is 15% of the population, and there are 50% more men in that group than women. Of the engaged group, that's only 9% of the population, and there are twice as many, 100% more men than women in that group. Here, you've got half the population, 50%, and the gender split is about equal. And here, a quarter of the population, 25% are completely uninterested, and there are twice as many women in that group than men. So importantly, 75% of the population are here. They're either completely uninterested or they're not actively looking. And if you want to dig more deeply into your audience and start to understand them, I would also recommend this, which is also on the, you can find through the British Science Association website. It's called the Michigan Public Engagement Framework. And they have constructed a framework for how to think about engaging in terms of here, they call it a university stakeholder, but this is your scientific communicator, this is you, your public stakeholder, the relationship between them, and the whole environment that they're working in. So you can see there's a correlation with this transactional model of communication. We're considering the whole environment. And they've set up a whole series of questions that they guide you through to analyse your stakeholder, your communicator, the relationship and the environment, so that you can identify where the opportunities and where the obstacles might be that you need to think about. All right, finally, so this is just an example of how they characterise audiences through that model, and some of the questions that they ask that you can go through. How motivated are your audience? What kind of decision-making power do they have, and so on. Okay, a few more comments about audience. First, use your product design phase and we'll talk more about formative evaluation later, to study your target audience. And really the idea is to start that communication without imposing any of your views. Just try and make the connection and get their perceptions of what's important to them, how they feel about the science and so on. Use your network when you're designing a communication. You have a network already here, so use that to reflect on how you're doing it, get feedback on how you're designing a project, so you can start to see, oh, I made this assumption here, that's probably not appropriate, or I need to think about something else as well. And this might also help you to find connections to your audience that you didn't have before. Other people might say, oh, I know this organisation who's active in that area, they already connect with this community, you should talk to them, they can introduce you. This is something we haven't talked about yet. Identify where your audience is, okay? You probably all know or are part of an organisation that has some information and they want to get it out to their audience, so they put it on their website. There we go. So unless you're NASA, it's probably not going to be very effective, right? There's very few people who are going to be checking your website unless you make them go there, right? Which is obviously a role of social media. But let's say you've identified your audience are on this particular Facebook group. Join the Facebook group, start talking there. They meet regularly in person at a sports event, I don't know. Go, talk to them there. They read the Sunday paper, write an article. Put your communication where your audience already are. You can't expect them to come to you. You must go to them. And as I mentioned, liaisons, ambassadors. So if you don't have a connection to your audience already, that is a huge obstacle. You need to find somebody who ideally is already in that community, who is trusted by that community, who you can talk to and get them to understand the value of what you want to do. And then they can say, oh, okay, all right, well, come along to this and meet this person, come to this meeting, and so on. You need them to vouch for you, introduce you to your audience, so that there's already an element of trust, which is really important. You need to establish that connection and that trust. All right. So we started from this point. What, why, who? And we've been talking about who. Who is the starting point? Then we need to go to why. All right, so I have some idea about my audience now. Now, why do I want to communicate with them? How is it relevant to them? So, and why can be a lot of things. It can be, as we talked about before, to inform them of something, to consult with them, to get their input, to collaborate, to inspire, raise awareness, solve a problem, so on. Lots of why reasons. And a useful tool for thinking about why when you're designing a project is what's called these generic learning outcomes. This was designed in the museum community in the UK again, but it's quite useful, I think, for science communication. And they've set up these 5 different areas. So learning outcomes, right? These are why you might be doing an activity. So the first area of learning outcomes, generic learning outcomes, is knowledge and understanding, which is often an aim. You want people to know something, you want them to learn something, you want them to make more sense of it, make connections between things, get a deeper understanding. So when you're thinking about what you're doing, is this what you want to do? Are you trying to get them to have more knowledge and understanding? You may instead be wanting to teach them new skills, know how to do something. It could be intellectual skills, social skills, communication, physical skills. thinking about what you want to do in this way helps you to guide planning of your activities. You might want to influence their values and attitudes, their feelings, their perceptions, their opinions. You might want them to increase their capacity for tolerance, empathy, motivation, attitude towards an organisation. You might want to achieve enjoyment, inspiration, creativity. You might want them to have fun, be surprised, have new ideas, be creative, and so on. And finally, you might want to influence their behaviour, what people do, what they intend to do, a change in how they're actually acting. And finally, when we get to the end of all of that, so we've got who and why, then you get to what, which is where we usually start. Once you understand all of this, then you say, okay, what do I need to say now? That's the easy part. I'm not even going to talk about that because you know what you want to say, but you need to think about it in this context. Why and who?